Others can join in as they go. As you just saw, we are recording this and it'll be available to everyone here if you want to watch it again, or if there's people who couldn't make it, you want to share it with board members and other staff, absolutely, please share this. It's really great information, and we're grateful that we are able to record it and share these this seminar as we go on. I'm joining you from Saskatoon today in Treaty 6 territory. Sask Arts operates in Treaties 2, 4, 5, 6, 8, and 10. And we are working as an organization to better understand our treaty agreements with the original people of this province and how we can better reflect the province as a whole in our activities, including professional development, which is one of the ways that we're working with Sask Shift in this in arts action research in this program. I didn't say my name, it's written below my face, Alex Rogalski. I'm a program consultant with the organization, and the Sask Shift program has been kicked off in the fall as a partnership between Creative Saskatchewan, Sask Arts, and Arts Action Research as a opportunity for organizations to access professional development in a number of ways with our more intensive cohorts, of which I see a number of people here today who have participated in those cohorts, as well as these series of webinars that are open to anyone to participate in. This is, I think, our fourth one, and we still have another couple upcoming in May and June. So if you found out about this, you can use the same methods to get those dates and Zoom links for the next two that are coming up. Today, we're focusing on funding relationships and develops, something that is critical to arts organizations, especially in times of austerity, is figuring out who your organization is and where those financial resources exist to help benefit your organizations. It's something that applies to everyone, regardless of the scale of the organization you're affiliated with. It's my great pleasure to have Ann Dunning with us again today, leading today's webinar. I really appreciate everything Ann has contributed so far. The feedback we've been getting on this Sask Shift program has been remarkable. It tells us that there's a vital need for this work, and what's been offered on behalf of Ann and Becky and Nello, the whole team, has been vital, and I know we're going to benefit from these webinars for years to come. So with that, the only other things I have to say is if you would benefit from a live transcription, if that would be of some assistance to you, you can click at the top of your screen, you'll see otter.ai. If you click on that, a new window will open with a live transcription of the webinar. I'm going to be going off screen, and I think if everyone can remember, you're all very, very savvy at this, that you can either take your camera off if you feel like that you don't want to be seen, that's fine, as well as making sure you stay on mute just so that Ann can be the main focus of the presentation. And I know she'll have time for questions and answers towards the end of the seminar. So thanks for that, and I'll turn it over to Ann today.
Thanks, Alex, and thank you all for joining today. My name is Ann Dunning, and I am a Principal Associate with Arts Action Research. Today, I'm joining you from New York, and New York is on the ancestral lands of the Lenni Lenape people. So acknowledge their stewardship of the land that continues to this day. I am also happy to be able to, through this technology, reach all of you in the various places that you are, and through the recording, reach those of you who couldn't join us for the live session. As Alex mentioned, today's topic is one that is really pivotal to all of our organizations as we looked to resource the work that we're trying to do in our organizations. As you all know, the mission delivery work that you do does not always generate the revenue to sustain itself. That's a reality of the nonprofit sector. And so in our organizations as nonprofits, we do the work both of delivering our missions through the various activities through which we're able to achieve that. But we also have this piece of work in our organizations that requires us to generate the resources to fund those programs and activities through which we deliver our missions. And it is that part of our work, that revenue or resource generation, that I want to talk with you about today. And I want to share with you some thoughts about resource generation that really reflect a relational approach to fundraising and development, and really reflect the work that we at Arts Action Research have done with arts professionals and arts organizations in all of the places that we work, in understanding the most sort of effective, sustainable ways to find, attract, and sustain the support that we need to keep our organizations and our missions moving forward in the world. We talk about this as both fundraising and development, and I want to say a quick word about that, because I think that so often we talk about fundraising, and fundraising in itself is obviously an important function in that it is the act of raising the funds or bringing in the money that we need to resource our activities. But I think if we only talk about fundraising, we only talk about this act of bringing in the money, we miss a really big part of this work, which is the development aspect of the work. And so when we talk about development, what we really mean by development is the development of relationships broadly, throughout our communities, our supporter networks, et cetera. And those relationships are key to our ability to fundraise, but they're also key to our ability to build our boards, to build our constituencies, to engage with our communities in ways that both support our mission and take it out into the world to others. And so this development piece is part of the fundraising piece, and it's an important part of the fundraising piece, but also in and of itself, it is a really important piece of work that we all do in our organizations. In terms of taking a relational approach to fundraising and development, what I'm really talking about there is focusing our work in this area, our sort of resource generating work, on the idea that we generate resources by building meaningful relationships or connections between our organization, our mission, our work, and our people, and the people in our communities, in our networks, in our support resources, who care about and find those aspects of what we do meaningful and important for themselves and their community. And so really this relational piece is pivotal in that it puts at the center of the fundraising and development activity this idea of relationship building, of connecting people, of creating meaning, of making a place where people can care about and sustain their interest and engagement with our work and our organizations. And what I find so helpful about taking this approach is that what we see with relational fundraising approaches is that organizations of all sizes can scale a relational approach to their organization. So if you are a small organization and you can only maintain 10 relationships, you can put a relational approach in place for your fundraising and development and build sustained, meaningful relationships over time. If you're a massive organization with many staff and board members and systems in place, and you can maintain thousands of relationships with people in your community and in your support network, then you can also work with the same sort of framework of building relationships, developing and deepening them over time, and creating a sustainable base of support for your organization. And so, one of the great things I think about this approach is that it is not specific to the resource base that you have as an organization. It can be adapted to the resources that you have. Also, it is a sustainable approach to fundraising in that it doesn't depend on a single grant or a single appeal. It builds over time these ongoing relationships, and therefore allows us to build a base of support that is less at risk of dropping out or disappearing due to the loss of a single relationship or a single conduit of resources. And so I'm going to share with you some thoughts about this kind of a framework, how it works, why it's important, and also how you can apply it in your own organizations as you think about how do we structure the fundraising and development work for our organization. Given that we're doing this on Zoom and there are always challenges of sitting and listening to someone speak for an extended period of time, I'm going to divide this into sort of 3 sections. And after each section, I'll take questions, we'll take a quick break, and then move on to the next section to give us a little bit of a focus for each of the areas that we're talking about. And the first part of the workshop, I'm going to focus on the context for fundraising and development right now. I want to share with you a little bit of what's been going on in terms of the fundraising development world, some of the trends, some of the challenges, changes, opportunities that are on the horizon in this area, so that we sort of understand the context in which you're applying your own framework of fundraising and development. Second, I'm going to share with you the principles of relational fundraising, how we build relationships, what are the effective approaches to relational fundraising, and how does that get structured in terms of the relationships that you have with different supporters and funders. And then finally, I'm going to share with you a framework for creating your own relational fundraising and development plan that actually implements those principles of relational fundraising and development. So we'll start with the sort of big picture. We'll focus then on the principles of this approach to fundraising. And finally, we'll give you some tools in terms of how to then take that and apply it for your organization. So I'm going to start with this piece that focuses on the current context. And I'm going to put some slides up here just to give you something to look at while we talk through this. Bear with me for a second. I'm going to get the slideshow to start. Okay. So I want to share with you 7 observations about some of the things that are happening and have been happening over the past number of years in terms of the climate or environment for fundraising and development in the nonprofit arts and culture sector. And these are sort of big picture things. Some of them are newer, some of them have been happening over a period of time, but 7 things that I think you should be aware of as you're thinking about fundraising and development for your organization. The first thing that I want to talk about is that we are seeing an emergence or the emergence of a new generation of donors, supporters, philanthropists. And these new generation donors and philanthropists approach their giving in a fundamentally different way than prior donors did. There are changes in the way that these organizations relate to their organization, the organizations that they support. And understanding this sort of new generation of donors is important as we think about how do we build relationships? How do we understand and build relationships with this new generation that's coming along? And the first thing I think that it's important to know about this generation of donors, and it actually has been true for at least the prior generation of donors, is that the wealthiest people are not the biggest supporters of the nonprofit sector. So when we talk about giving, more giving actually comes from the middle class than from the wealthiest classes of people in our society. And so this sort of raises sort of the myth that often goes around in the fundraising community of what we've got to do is find the wealthiest people and ask them for money. In fact, the smart strategy, given that the bulk of the wealth that comes to nonprofits comes from the middle class, is to build multiple relationships with multiple people who have capacity to give, but aren't those wealthiest people who are constantly getting asked and who frankly often are holding on to their wealth to maintain and build their wealth and status. And so we have to kind of shift our thinking about who are the prospective donors, and they're not, as we often think, the wealthiest people in our community or our society. Second, in terms of who are the donors and who is this emerging donor class, we have to recognize that we are on the beginning edge of a major wealth transfer as the boomer generation starts to leave their wealth and resources to their children and grandchildren. And so we now have a sort of younger generations of supporters who are receiving their generational wealth through their family lineages. Those folks have different values and different ways of approaching their giving. And so we need to be able to speak to donors who are not just boomer generation donors, but who are of the generations, the millennial generation, and even Gen Y donors who now are receiving wealth from prior generations and want to support the causes around them. What we know about millennial donors is that they have a greater interest than prior generations in being directly involved with the organizations that they support. There is a greater link between volunteering and giving for these donors. They want reporting from the organizations that they give to. They want to be sort of actively involved in understanding how their support matters and has impact. And so we have a fundamentally sort of different way of communicating with these kinds of donors who really want to understand, be involved, and be engaged, not just write a check and walk away. And so that's an important trend for us to understand as we think about our donors and our supporters. Also, this generation of donors is increasingly well informed about the nonprofit sector because of the technology tools, websites that track nonprofits and their organizational values, their measures of success, et cetera. There is an abundance of information about the health of nonprofits, about the functioning of nonprofits that donors can now access easily because the technology tools are available to everyone. And finally, I think that what we're seeing is with this new generation of donors, we're seeing that they have more of an interest of directing their funding. We're seeing more of these donors give not just to sort of organizations to perpetuate the organization or the mission, but to particular projects and programs. They are quite interested, again, because of their interest in sort of aligning themselves with the work, in really directing how their funds might be used and who it might impact. And so where prior generations might have been sort of committed to an organization and a mission and would give more general operating funds, we're seeing that there is a tendency for new generations to be more focused on project or program funds that align with their values and interests. The second observation is that we are experiencing and have been experiencing for a number of years a shift in foundation grant making. And foundation grant making, I will say, is very different in Canada than from the US. I'm familiar with both systems, having been a grant seeker in both. Obviously, there's a lot of wealth that is in the foundation world in the US that is less predominant in the Canadian foundation system. But in both cases, I think the foundation world has undergone a kind of shift in philosophy about how they support the nonprofits in their communities. Most foundations have moved away from the sort of general operating support and into project funding, again, really focusing much more on how they can direct their funding to specific causes or opportunities, less interested in sustaining the infrastructure and organizations in the sector than foundations used to be in the past. Foundations tend to want to fund on cycles, not creating long-term sustaining relationships with organizations. but leaving themselves the ability to continue to jump from one cause or issue to another, and not getting tied down to a sort of group of organizations that they are funding or sustaining. We're also seeing that foundations have become more prescriptive or curatorial, oftentimes not seeking to hear from the community about what the community needs, but rather creating their own structured programs and providing funding for nonprofits to deliver their goals and the metrics that they're trying to achieve. And so we're seeing foundations taking over some of the role of what nonprofits used to do in the community in terms of determining what are the priorities and the focus of the work in the sector. And finally, we're seeing that foundations, like many others actually in our funding sector, have really become much more impact focused. We are getting increasing demands from these funders for metrics that track the impact of their funding. And this, of course, puts additional pressure on nonprofits to really build the infrastructure to track and report on these things. It also requires our organizations to really reflect the values or the impacts that others, like the foundation boards, are trying to achieve. And sometimes those things are not aligned with the values of our organizations in the nonprofit sector. The third observation is that we are facing the loss of corporate philanthropy in the nonprofit sector. This, for many of you, is probably already a done deal. Getting corporate money in the nonprofit arts and culture has become increasingly rare and difficult. And straight up philanthropy, the sort of donation of resources, really got phased out as sponsorship took over, and the idea that corporations would give, but only in exchange for some kind of recognition or marketing or branding for their organization. And so with that being the focus, the challenge, of course, is that most arts organizations, or many arts organizations, do not have the market segment to compete with things like huge sports events, major commercial music festivals, et cetera, that draw huge audiences. The arts and culture sector simply does not have that level of exposure, and therefore often less interesting to corporations who are looking for sponsorship. Even if you have a relationship with someone in a corporation, it is much more difficult to leverage the support of those corporations than it used to be. It used to be that corporations would give their senior executives the opportunity to support their community, sort of an incentive for a lot of folks within the structure. That has become less prevalent, particularly in large multinational organizations who have shifted their giving or their spending in the nonprofits sector from the local level to the national level and even the international level, supporting sort of causes that they feel align best with their brand, and sort of centralizing their support. And so we see for a lot of nonprofits, and particularly small to mid-sized arts and culture nonprofits, there really isn't a lot of corporate support out there to be tapped. The fourth observation is that within the fundraising and development aspect of our work, we are subject to the creeping influence of consumerism. And what I mean by that is that this sort of consumeristic transactional mindset that has really grown and developed in North America and sort of taken over from citizenship and community, has also really influenced our fundraising in that it has become increasingly difficult to make a case with donors to make a donation or support an organization simply for the purpose of community good, for the idea that this organization and the support of this organization will benefit the community, will support our neighborhoods and our citizens. Instead, what we're seeing more and more is a move towards a sort of transactional relationship in fundraising, in which donors expect a series of benefits, invitations to parties and events, higher and higher levels of recognition for their support. And so they're starting to see their giving as a transaction and looking for what they get in return for that transaction personally, rather than thinking about philanthropy as an act of community support and community good. And so that influence of consumerism has shifted the way that our donor pool behaves, and also the way that we as fundraisers build relationships over time. It has led in our sector to an increase in treating donors like customers rather than supporters, thinking of them as VIPs, making sure that we're providing them with benefits or returns on their giving to the organization. And while some of that can be helpful in building relationships, some of it simply becomes an additional burden of work for our organizations and fundamentally changes the relationship between an organization and their supporters. And so it's important that we recognize and address this sort of change in how we think about and are supported. We certainly, in the fundraising and development sector, in the nonprofits, are adapting to technology tools. We're seeing these really change the way that fundraising and development happens. This happens on multiple levels, of course. The increasingly sophisticated CRMs, or customer relationship management tools, provide us with the opportunity to track relationships much more closely, to set up systemic responses, to sort of maintain communication and relationships. We're also seeing tools like crowdsourcing tools that allow us to set up campaigns with videos, with online giving portals, things that can connect easily to social media and other platforms that are reaching people. And the important thing to remember about these tools, they can be used well in our nonprofit sector, and we certainly should embrace them for what they can do for us. But we do have to remember that they are only tools. They're actually not an approach to fundraising. They don't replace a fundraising plan and a sort of thoughtful execution of our sort of relationship development over time. And also, I think we have to be careful about the connection, particularly between crowdfunding platforms and transactional relationships, that we don't create a basic marketplace for fundraising that replaces the sort of philanthropic nature of giving. And so that tends to be a push with those kinds of tools. And finally, I think with technology tools, we also have to be mindful of the sort of overload of certain platforms. I know that for a lot of organizations, we're seeing things like in the States, Giving Tuesday, a technology-driven giving opportunity, really maxed out and got to a point where it was so saturated that people were seeing real drop-offs in the giving for their organization around those kinds of technology-mediated events in fundraising. And so we do have to be aware of the sort of oversaturation of the technology tools and the use of technology tools in fundraising. Oops. I touched on this earlier, and I think this is really important in terms of the trends in fundraising and development. We're being asked to measure impact increasingly around our programs, and we're being asked to measure impact on other people's terms. We're being asked to track what matters to the donor, the funder, the foundation, rather than really focusing on measuring and understanding what matters to us as organizations. And sometimes those metrics are aligned, but often they are not, which leads to a sort of real disconnect in what we communicate about our work, and also leads to a lot of additional work for organizations in setting up metrics, tracking metrics, and reporting on metrics that may not be deeply engaged with the actual work and the mission of the organization. And so this focus on metrics, on measures of success, on outcomes, can be guiding for some organizations, but also can be overwhelming and can move us from the things that we value to the things that other people value or other sectors value. And so one of the things that we really have to be cautious about here as we think about this is the move to sort of functionalize art in the metrics that some organizations use to see art not as an end in itself, but as a way to create economic activity, to decrease societal tensions, to increase educational impacts. While art does all of those things, I think that when we lose the impact of art in and of itself and tie it to other metrics and other intentions, we have to be careful, because as those things become less important or priorities shift, the arts can get shuffled aside because they're no longer part of the sort of the moment impacts that people are looking at. And finally, we are working to address historical imbalances in the nonprofit arts and culture fundraising and development sector. One of the things that we've seen in the past number of years is funders and individuals who are really trying to address some of these historical imbalances about how funding has been directed within the sector, particularly around race, around ability, around access to resources. And so what we're seeing right now is certain funders who are directing more funding to areas of the sector that have been traditionally underfunded, trying to address how the funding has sort of flowed in certain directions, but not others. And we're also seeing that organizations are starting to be more mindful about how these historic imbalances have impacted the way that our sector has grown and developed over time. And so we're seeing changes like in the US, there is a growing movement called Community-Centric Fundraising that focuses nonprofits not on a sort of sense of fundraising solely for their organizations, and putting their organizations in competition with other like nonprofits in seeking out and trying to build resources, but in working together as a sector, as a community, to try and build a more equitable basis of fundraising that supports all organizations and the whole ecosystem that is required to really sustain and build the work, not just of one organization, but of the entire sector. And so these 7 things, I think, are all trends, are all shifts and sort of ideas that are important to be aware of as we start to build our own organization's approach to fundraising and development. We have to address the fact that there is an emerging new generation of donors. We have to think about how foundations consider their grant making, what their priorities are, and how they approach their relationship with grantees. We have to recognize that corporate philanthropy is a diminishing resource, and that it's unlikely to return large dollars or resources to our sector. We need to, as we think about how we relate to and build relationships with our donors and supporters, We need to recognize the influence of consumerism and sort of transactional approaches and adapt to the way that people think about giving and try to influence the way they think about giving to return to a philanthropic approach. We need to continue to look at the technology tools, learn the technology tools, and use the technology tools, but recognize that they are only tools. They're not an approach or framework for fundraising, and we need to build our approach to fundraising and integrate the tools in appropriate places. We need to recognize the desire for impact measures and look at how we can start to shift the impact measures from other people's terms or other organizations' terms to really reflect our own values and our own terms about impact and success and start to take more control over the impact of our sector and how we talk about it. And finally, we have to work with our peers and our partners and our funders to look at how we can address the historical imbalances in funding in our sector to not only support our own organizations, but also to build the infrastructure of the sector on which we all depend. So I'm going to stop sharing for a second and invite anybody to come on with any questions about the current context, about some of these trends, any observations you have that sort of add to or reflect on what I've shared with you so far. And feel free just to put your mic on if you have anything you want to throw out there.
Hi. I just nothing really to add, but what I did want to say is it was so nice to see that articulated so clearly, because it feels like we run a theater, but then we do all these other things. So that's all I wanted to say is that's really helped me kind of articulate thoughts and feelings we've been experiencing here at our organization specifically. So thank you.
Great. I'm glad that resonated with you and you could sort of really see that in your work. And thank you, Mark. I see you also have that same feeling about that. Any other questions, thoughts?
Hi, Anne, it's Darcy. I think the metrics piece is something that we might all struggle with these days, but I'm kind of, I got an active board and they really want to look at some metrics for our sector, which is interactive digital media. So it's on my plate to do for this new fiscal year for 22-23. So I'm just designing some of those metrics that I think we want to kind of have a bit more of a discussion on. So I think this is kind of timely. And so I really appreciate you talking about metrics because I might just be in that fold now here for this new fiscal year. So thank you for that.
Sure. And, I will say that I think it is important for us to have these conversations about metrics within our organizations and within our field, because again, I think if we don't do it, someone else is going to set the metrics for us. And to me, that is the bigger challenge, because if we're trying to meet their metrics, it's very different than if we say, these are the metrics of success for us, and we measure against it, then there's value, at least for us, in that work.
Yeah, and one extension to that is that if we don't do it, our membership may do it for us, and we might not like, well, I'll say that with caution, we might not like what a member or membership provides as a metric, because it could be really broad, and then you'll never ever, well, in my history of that, you'll never have a really good sounding point for that.
Right. Yeah, I think the thing with metrics, yes, it's absolutely about like who defines them and then who tracks them and reports on them. And, I think the more that those of us who track and report on them can define them, the more aligned they are going to be with the kinds of values we're trying to achieve. Any other questions or thoughts on this sort of context piece? Okay. I'm going to suggest we take a quick break so that you can take a break from looking at the Zoom screen. And let's say we'll take until 10:02. So at 1:50, we will reconvene and we will dive into the principles of relational fundraising and development. Thank you. Alex has restarted the recording. I see some thumbs up and things, so I'm seeing that you're back. Thank you. I just want to mention I dropped into the chat a Google document link. I'm going to, in the next set of slides, I'm going to show some diagrams. I don't want you to have to draw them all out yourself, so I've provided a handout that actually has the diagrams so that you can just focus on listening and you don't have to try and capture what's on your screen. So feel free to link to that to get that, that PDF document as needed. So as I said before the break, you know, we have this sort of environment in which we're fundraising. There are some trends and some issues and some opportunities that we need to look at within that environment. And I see, yes, the answering emails definitely I answered emails at the break for sure. I want to now kind of look at how do you respond to this environment? How do you build a sort of approach, a strategy, a way of fundraising and development for your organization that fits both with your organizational capacity and with this environment in which we're fundraising, and addresses some of those challenges and helps you to navigate that world. And so what I want to share with you now is sort of the structure, the principles of a relational fundraising and development approach, of using this kind of focus to really build and sustain relationships over time. And through that, to build the resources that your organization needs to thrive and to achieve your mission. And so there really is one fundamental principle of this approach to fundraising, which is that relationships, creating relationships, sustaining relationships, deepening relationships, relationships and the work that we do in building and sustaining them is at the core of our fundraising and development work. And so really sort of thinking about and reframing our fundraising and development approach around this idea that what we really want to be doing is putting our energy and effort into this work of creating and building relationships on behalf of our organization. And when I say relationships on behalf of our organization, what do we mean by creating relationships with potential supporters in our community? Well, relationships that people have with us are generally connected to one of two things. Someone is in a relationship with us either because of the work, because the work that we do has meaning for them. They make a connection with the work, they believe in the work. The work impacts them in some ways or impacts people they care about in some ways. And so in many cases, we create a relationship through the work that we do. We generate a relationship through the work that we do. The other way we create relationships is through people. Clearly, you know, one of our human natures is to connect with other people and to build relationships, and we do that in all aspects of our lives in all ways. And in nonprofit organizations, one of the ways that we bring people to us and engage them to support our work is through our people. And for our nonprofit arts organizations, our people are our artists and our staff and our constituents and our boards. All of these people create potential connection points for relationships between your organization and your community and the world beyond. And so these are the relationships that we're talking about when we're talking about a relational fundraising and development plan, is how do we connect people to our people and our work, and how do we build, deepen, and sustain those relationships between our community members, between our supporters, and our work and our people. And so that's really the fundamental piece of what we're trying to do in relational fundraising and development. And what we know is that relationships really come about as a result of shared values and meaning. And meaning is that sense or that belief that something has value or importance for you. And so when I say, we need to create meaning for people, we need to create value, purpose, engagement that matters to them. We need to think about who cares about what we do. For whom does this work have meaning? For whom do these people have meaning? And that meaning is what creates energy and engagement in those relationships. And so in a lot of ways, this sort of relational framework really is about how do we create and deepen meaning for those folks in our community who connect to, who engage with, who care about the work that we do. And with these relationships, there is a sort of framework in which we build and sustain and grow these relationships. And I want to share with you an approach to the relationships. So we again show you slides here. So in the core principles. So we think about organizations in this sort of concentric circle way, because as we observe nonprofit arts and culture organizations, what we see is that the way that they organize, the way that they operate is sort of fundamentally structured in this way of having sort of a leadership at the center of the organization that is defined uniquely for the organization in terms of who are the arts professionals within the organization who take on the role of defining the vision and working with others to achieve that vision and mission for the organization. And affiliated on the artistic side with that center, there are these concentric circles of collaborators or team members that leadership at the center will pull in and engage with for different aspects of the work. And so we have this sort of close-knit group of core collaborators who are sort of deeply involved, who deeply understand the work, who can be called upon to sort of reflect on decisions and the way forward and really support the leadership at the center. Then we have a group of collaborators who maybe are not in that core group, but they are connected, they are aware of the work that we're doing, even if peripherally, and they can be brought in, do the work with us, and then maybe go out and do work with others, but they remain within our kind of network, and they know how we work, and they can fit into our working practice and way of approaching the work. And then finally, there's this, this outer tier of collaborators or team members that we call need-specific team members. These are folks that we need for very particular purposes, who have a particular skill or knowledge base that really supports the work that we're doing, but they don't need to be involved in the planning and development. They're not collaborators who we necessarily would pull in to make some key decisions. We simply will call them in when we need their skills and expertise. They come in and do the work and then may disperse and do never return to the organization, but provide that support in a pivotal moment. And so just as we see this kind of relationship within the structure and the way that we work artistically or programmatically, we also similarly see that our funder-supporter relationships follow this sort of pattern of concentric circles of engagement or connection to our organization. And so I want to talk about these different sort of types of relationships that we have, these different layers of relationships that we have within our pool of funders and supporters. And the first group, the ones that are kind of most closely related to our organization, most deeply attached, for whom we have great meaning, either because they have a real deep connection to the people or to the work, are what we call core or annual supporters. And the folks that fall into this category are the folks who give to us on a regular basis. They support our mission and our organization. They're not necessarily directing their support simply to one project or program that they're interested in. They really believe in our work and they're committed supporters of that work. We can count on them to really be there when we need support and help. They're not all big money donors. There are many folks who give a small amount, but do that regularly, year after year, project after project, appeal after appeal. These are the folks who really stick with us, who believe in our work, who are committed to us, and who really make a difference in the sort of sustainable baseline of our support. Mostly these folks are individual supporters. We don't see a lot of institutions anymore who provide this core annual support, with the exception of government support. Many of our government supporters are these kind of core annual supporters who really commit to our organizations over extended periods of time and provide more operational support to our organizations. But other than those governments, we don't see a lot of foundations in here. We certainly don't see corporations who sort of support us in that kind of ongoing, sustained way. And so individuals are really kind of critical to this piece. Most often we see our board members in here. They're the folks who, they step up for us and for our missions. And one of the ways they do that is through leadership giving. And so they often are that part of this core group. These folks don't need sort of flashy events. They don't need four-color brochures. They just need access and information. They need to be sort of kept in the loop. They need to be part of our sort of inner circle. These are the folks you should, tell about the great things that are happening, about the next thing that's coming up in advance. These are the folks that should feel like they're the best friends, that they hear from us, that they are connected to us. And so we don't have to do a lot of jumping through hoops for them. We don't have to do lots of special presentations, but we do have to make opportunities for them to connect with us and with the work. And we do have to keep them informed and make them feel like they're part of it, because they very much are. This is a core piece of their relationship with us, is they're in it with us. The second group of supporters are what we call project or program supporters or funders. And these folks, as the name implies, are often those supporters who have a real interest in one of the initiatives that we're taking on or one of our programs. They want to support that or align with that. It connects with their values. They want to give us a, sort of a piece of support, but they may not sustain that support over time. They want to kind of consider how the support has impact and decide if they want to continue to support you in that way. Some folks in this category are individuals. There certainly are individual donors who really like to put their money into a specific program or project that they can feel that they're supporting and that is having impact. But this also is where many of this institutional supporters, certainly foundations, live here. They really want to, put their money behind certain initiatives and not necessarily into the sort of foundational general operating support. For these folks, it's getting them involved and keeping them involved is a more intensive process in that you need to continually make a case for support for the particular project or program that's happening. They want often reporting on their particular project or program. They want applications, they want metrics, et cetera. And so there's a higher level of information, of resources that go into courting and sustaining group folks in this project or program support tier. And then finally, we've got this tier of supporters that are what we call transactional or reciprocal supporters. And these are the folks who sort of live in that consumerist realm of they will give you some resources, some support, but in exchange for something that they get out of it. And so, for example, people who show up for a gala event are transactional supporters in that event, in that they pay the money for the gala ticket. It goes to support the organization, but they get a party, social event, opportunity to, sort of show off to their friends, etc. This is also where the sort of sponsorship piece lives, at an organization, where individual gives support to you, but in return, they expect a certain type of recognition or marketing or branding positioning for their organization. And so there's a transaction, there's a reciprocity that's expected for that support that goes beyond simply supporting the mission and the work that the organization does. This is also where things like naming opportunities come up. Where we have a capital campaign, there's a lot of transactional support, naming a venue, naming a scholarship, that kind of thing would all be kind of a transactional or reciprocal piece of support in which the donor gets recognition in exchange for their support. Because these donors are looking for something in return, this tends to be the most high intensity in terms of our capacity. We have to do a fair amount of work putting on events, doing the marketing and promotion of these partners. And so this is a piece of fundraising that requires more regular maintenance. It's also the case that these folks are making the decision based on the moment. They are not signing up for multiple year support. They're not saying, I'll be at the gala every year. They're not saying, this is a sponsorship for multiple years. Each time we want their support, we need to go and sell them the ticket, sell them the sponsorship, etc. And so there isn't as much of a sustained piece of support here. They can come and go. Some of these folks may go and support other organizations. And so there's a lot of moving around within this space. And so you've got these sort of tiers of relationships. And one of the things in terms of a relational fundraising and development strategy is we really have to think about who is in each of these tiers for us and how do we really spend our time and resources in nurturing the relationships in each area. And while it seems like the return on investment in the transactional realm may be less, you also have to balance the fact that the transactional realm often is money that you can get on a shorter timeline. In other words, we can sell tickets to an event more quickly than building relationships with a potential major donor for multi-year support. It may take us 2 or 3 years to develop the donor, whereas if the event is on Friday, we can sell the tickets today. And so part of it may be our timeline and our access to people. Part of it may be who's in our community and what relationships do we have. And so we have to allocate our time and resources and focus in these different relationships. And that may shift over time. We may spend more time writing grants early on to sort of build some support for our projects and programs. But as those programs take flight and more individuals get interested in them, we may start to shift our focus more to our core funding and our annual appeals and really build an individual donor base. And so these things can change over time. In terms of relationships, individuals or organizations may shift between different kinds of relationships. We may meet somebody in a transactional relationship. They come to our event or gala. They were brought by a friend. They bought a ticket. They came for the party. But when they get there, they meet people and they hear about the work we're doing. And they may, in that moment, say, this actually has a lot of meaning for me. And if we nurture that relationship over time, we may find that that person shifts into the core annual donor relationship. And so, some of these relationships, they're certainly not static. We can develop some of these sort of relationships over time. Interestingly, it tends to be the transactional folks that come into the core rather than the project or program supporters who tend to be quite comfortable working in a space like the foundations, like the donors who are really focused on impact, with giving their money for particular projects or programs, and are less interested in becoming sort of sustained ongoing supporters of the organization. And so we have this sort of framework then in terms of building relationships and thinking about the relationships that we have with people in our community and at our support networks. And fundamental to the success of our fundraising and development is really our ability to continue to build new relationships and build deeper, better relationships. And so our activities each year are going to be focused on how do we engage new people in these relationships, in these supporting relationships with our organization, and how do we enhance, deepen, or develop the relationships that we already have in place? What are the tools, what are the opportunities to create greater meaning and connection in those spaces? And there are a few things, I think, that I've seen from organizations and how they approach these relationships that are helpful sort of tips and approaches to relationship building that I think are fundamental to a relational fundraising and development plan. And the first is to recognize that, like all relationships in all aspects of our lives, funding relationships take time and require nurturing. Funding relationships, if we really want to sort of build a sustained base of support, require us to sort of put our resources, our time, our energy into making connections, into building and deepening those connections, and into nurturing that space. And so it's not a one and done activity when we think about fundraising and development from a relational perspective. We really have to think about it as an ongoing activity, as a cyclical activity, as something that we're committed to with these people who care about our work and who want to support it, and not simply as a sales transaction if we get them in the door one time and we're done. Related to that, I think that if we're really going to take this approach to our fundraising and development, we need to nurture and develop a long-term, not short-term perspective about fundraising. We need to think about the investments we're making now that will not show up in the current year budget and may not show up in the next year budget, but that long-term will have greater impact for our organization. And so, that often means, that we are building relationships with new potential donors who are not going to, give us the $20,000 this year, but 3 years from now, they're going to start giving us $10,000 a year for 10 years. And that's going to have a greater impact for us long term. And so we have to think about this as an investment, as a long-term engagement, as opposed to the short-term transaction of what can we get in the moment. Another thing I think that's critical, to thinking about this as truly a sort of a relationship framework is we have to think about our supporters and our engagement with them around more than just money. We need money, and that's a big part of what drives our development work, is really trying to build relationships with folks who find it meaningful enough that they want to support us with money. And I'm not saying that we don't want that support. We absolutely want that support. But I think that the sort of singular focus on financial resources often leaves out and leaves on the table other resources that may be easier for people to commit and may have equal or greater impact for us, again, in the long term as organizations, if we really thought about those relationships and building them and accessing different kinds of resources. So for example, thinking about, as we're nurturing relationships with people who care about our work, what are their skills and expertise? Is there a need for those in our organization? Would they be willing to provide us with some pro bono support in areas that would actually reduce the money that we would have to outlay for those services. And so thinking about those kinds of things. Do they have a company or have access to product that we use or need? Can they loan things to us or give things to us that will, again, reduce the expenditures that we have to undertake in order to achieve our programming? You know, often this happens with local restaurants and thinking about, you know, will they donate a certain amount of food or product that can be used for a reception or for artist food that defrays costs for us and really allows us to use their resources effectively in the support of our missions. And finally, you know, I think increasingly there are barter economies popping up in different communities. I know we're starting to see some of these, particularly in New York, where cost of living is very high and people are connecting using technology to barter things that they have for things that they need. Arts and culture organizations are actually pretty well set up to jump into some of these barter communities and to identify needs and provide resources that through a sort of barter exchange can benefit the organization. So thinking sort of more broadly than just focusing on the money can open a sort of world of resources that can have real impact for our organizations. And so thinking about development not simply as the check, but also the broader sort of network of resources that we need. Another thing I think that's really important as we think about relationships and how we build relationships is recognizing that there is a networking effect of relationships and a influence effect within relationships that is important in our organizations and that we should be aware of and that we should tap into when we can. So what I mean by that is that people are often encouraged by others in their community and by recommendations from people they trust to commit to attending an event, to making a donation. And so, you know, the most obvious, of course, is with those folks who are very close to us, like our board members. Their giving to our organization, their leadership support of our organization is an important relationship building tool in that the people in their communities see them giving and are more likely to sort of follow that lead, to sort of see this as a place where they too could support the work of the organization. Likewise, a recommendation or an ask from a board member. This is a great organization. I think you would really be interested in what we're doing here. We'd love to have your support. That personal recommendation, that personal influence really impacts our ability to build relationships. And so really need to be aware of our networks, who's in our networks, who do we know, who can bring others to us, and who by their giving can also model for other folks in their community and encourage other folks to want to be part of our support network. And so one of the other ways we often see this, which is quite successful for campaigns, is an individual who puts forward or an organization who puts forward matching funds for a campaign. You know, that has both a modeling effect. People see, oh, somebody's put up support, and it has an impact effect in people thinking, wow, if I give now, they'll put up, they'll match my gift, and my giving in this moment will have greater impact. And so matching gifts are a way both to model and engage people in giving and also to increase the impact of their gifts. And then finally, in terms of this sort of approach to relationships, I think it's really important to think holistically about the relationships that we have with people. I think we have suffered maybe, and particularly I would say in mid to larger size organizations, in compartmentalizing the different activities of our organization. And so, for example, we often have a sales and marketing department that deals with admissions or ticket sales and really builds that part of a relationship. And then we have a fundraising and development side that looks at how can we build memberships and or donors. And then we have a volunteer recruiter or coordinator who looks at how do I get volunteers for this organization. And I think we need to, as organizations, think more holistically about the relationships that we have with people, in that, quite often someone who engages in one way builds a relationship that can be deepened by engaging in one of these other ways with our organization. And so as we think about and build these funding relationships, I think we also have to have an eye to how do we deepen the engagement with those who are supporting us by connecting them to opportunities to be patrons of the work, to come and to see performances or visit the gallery or attend programming events. How do we open the opportunity for them to volunteer and to help to support us on particular events or activities we're doing, or even to get involved and develop into board members. And so keeping these things together and thinking about them holistically, I think, is really important to sort of building a sustained relationship and a deeper relationship with those individuals who care about our work and connect with it. One of the things that we also see, and this often happens with mid-size organizations or larger organizations, is if we're running multiple campaigns or asks for different things, we may be doing an annual campaign ask, we may be doing a special campaign for a scholarship program, we may be doing a capital campaign to raise money to renovate our building. If we have multiple streams of fundraising that are happening simultaneously, I think we also need to think about that holistically in terms of how that impacts our donors and their potential support, and think about packaging our appeal to donors to say, you can support us in multiple ways by giving to a comprehensive campaign or some sort of conglomerate campaign, so that they don't feel like every time they turn around, they're being asked for something different, which implies that there isn't a kind of relationship or holistic approach to funding at the organization. And so thinking about, particularly as we get into a space where we're asking for multiple things or looking for multiple things from our community, really being smart about how we communicate that and bringing that together into a holistic message, so they can really see how their support has impact and how they can have that sort of ongoing and deeply connected relationship. So this relational approach, what really focuses on what is the relationship we have with donors, how do we build new relationships, and how do we deepen the relationships that we have. It has a number of benefits for nonprofit arts and culture organizations. And I want to reflect on a few of them that I've seen that I think are helpful as we try and get our board members and our staff committed to a sort of relational environment within our organization, one that elevates and encourages the building of relationships with our support network. The first is that I think one of the great things about a relational approach is that the connection between the organization and the supporter is genuine. It aligns their interests with your vision, mission, and values. At the base of it, that is what this relationship is about, is really creating a values alignment, creating meaning. Which means that we don't have to get into that awkward space of trying to kind of sell somebody on something by making it flashier, more interesting, newer, more innovative, et cetera. We can really dig into and focus on what are our mission, vision, and values, and who cares about and connects with those things. And so there's a genuine connection, and one that I think makes it more comfortable and easier for people within the organization to build these relationships. Second, it's not a competitive form of fundraising. We're not trying to beat out the other theater that operates in our town, or the other art gallery that operates in our town. If it's really about relationships, an individual can have relationships with multiple organizations, just as you can have relationships with multiple people. And so it's not a competitive mindset. It's not, we have to get to that donor before so-and-so does. We simply have to create meaning and connection with that supporter, and somebody else may likewise create meaning and connection, and that person may support both organizations. And that is a win-win. That is a fundamental benefit both for our organizations and our ecology and infrastructure as an arts and culture community. And so this approach, this focusing on relationships, takes us out of a competitive mindset of, if I get it, you don't get it. Relationships are expandable. People can sustain more than one relationship and therefore can support more than one organization. The other thing I think about this approach is that in focusing on the relationship to the people and the work or mission, it takes us away from this sort of opportunistic funding cycle that we often get into, where we feel like we constantly have to build new programs, reach new people, do something different in order to attract the attention of a potential funder. It's this thing that we often call chasing the money, right? It's like a new grant program comes out and suddenly everybody's like, well, what can I do to make, create some sort of program that serves underserved kids? Because this program is putting a lot of money into underserved kids and I want to get some of it. If we really take a relational approach, we look at what we do and we try and connect the people who care about that with that work, rather than creating new programs, building new infrastructure, pushing ourselves beyond our capacity in order to attract some funding, which frankly is probably going to disappear within 2 to 3 years and leave us with an unfunded program. And so if we can really build from what our mission, vision, and values are, connect people and organizations to that, and build sustainable relationships rather than chasing money around looking for a project that we can create to bring in money, it creates a much more sustainable base for our organizations. The relational approach, if we really start to commit to, on a full organizational scale, to building relationships, to sustaining and growing them, what it does is it allows us to create continuity. So even if staff transitions, even if our board transitions, if we have relationships and we're tracking relationships, we can continue to build their connection to the new people in our organizations, to the people that they know within the organization, and to the work that's happening in the organization. And so it's not dependent solely on one person being in place. It allows us to sort of survive transition and keep building those relationships with individuals over time. And finally, I think the other piece that's so important about this relationship piece is if we really connect it holistically throughout our organization, it serves so much more than simply the fundraising bottom line for the year. In building relationships, we're building community advocates, we're building patrons for our programs and for our artists and communities. We're building potential future board members to support our governance and infrastructure. And so it's connected to those things and it supports those things in a very tangible way that I think makes the time and effort we put into relationships doubly important and significant for us. I'm going to stop sharing and check in to see if anybody has any questions about this sort of relational approach, the framework of relationships that I've laid out, or some of the ways in which we sort of maximize relationships to build support and resources. Let's see if there's any questions. Okay, looks like we're all sort of caught up with that and on board with that. I can take a quick break now, or I can jump right into a sort of framework for this. Hands up if anybody needs a break right now. Looks like you're all good to plow into part 3. Great. So I'm going to jump into sort of how do we then apply these principles and create a fundraising and development plan using the relational fundraising and development approach. So let's pull this up again. Okay. So I think one of the tools that we really need for almost everything that we do in our work is we need some sort of planning framework for each of the things that we undertake. And plans really, I think are critical because they help us to identify, achieve, and measure our goals. They help us to really focus ourselves around what we're trying to do to achieve those things, to really, put our resources in place to make those things happen, and to then measure and track and reflect on what we've been able to achieve. And when we have a plan, particularly in an area like fundraising, it also allows us to engage multiple parts of our organization and people in our organization in understanding what we're doing and how they can contribute. And I think this is particularly important when we're talking about a relational plan, in that the more people within our organization who are building relationships, sustaining relationships, deepening relationships on our behalf, the better. That increases our capacity to sort of build this network of support. And so if we have a plan that everyone can see and understand, that really helps them to be part of it and to really commit to it. And so, the first thing I'll say here is, I encourage you, whether you're an executive or a development director or a board member, to think about what your annual cycle is around planning, execution, and review of your fundraising and development, and really try to work with and bring together a team of people who are going to commit to planning, to creating timelines, to breaking down the work into manageable steps, to assigning tasks and taking on roles in that process, and to continuing to go back to the plan, to reflect on what you've achieved, and to adapt and change plans as needed. And so really seeing this process as an ongoing living process for your organization, of really taking the time with your fundraising and development to set aside a focus on what are we trying to achieve, how are we achieving it, and reflecting on what's working, what's not working, and how do we adapt our strategies and approaches. And so in terms of thinking about that, I really have this sort of framework in mind when I think about relational and fundraising and development and how I go about planning it. And it actually sort of fits together two cycles of activity as I think about it. And so you get this sort of odd little snowman kind of diagram that I've got here to show you. The one cycle of the activity is what I call the development strategy cycle. That's the cycle in which we take stock of our current position, we set goals, we feed into the activity of relational building and development, and then we come back up and assess our results and move back into assessing our current position, setting goals. And so there's that cycle of activity that happens, which is sort of often for many of us is an annual cycle because we do an annual budget and we want to align our fundraising resources with our annual budget. In addition to that, and probably at the heart of that really, is this relationship building cycle. This cycle of sort of identifying those folks who are prospective supporters, those folks for whom our work has or could have meaning, to cultivate our relationships with them, to make an ask of them for some kind of support, to follow up and track our relationship and how it changes through this cycle. And then to continue to cycle through that, to continue the cultivation, asking and following up with them, but also then to feed back into our development strategy cycle of assessing our results within that sort of relationship circle and how it feeds into our full development strategy plan or cycle. And so these two sort of interconnected cycles of activity form a process that I think can help us to shape our plans and think about how do we as an organization apply a relational approach to this work. And so I'm going to talk us through each sort of step in this, in these cycles, what that looks like, what it means for you as an organization, how you might go about these things. And so the very first thing that I do in any planning cycle is articulate and assess current reality. because it is very hard to build plans if we aren't all in agreement about where we're starting from. And so when we're talking about fundraising and development, articulating current reality is really about assessing how much do we currently raise through our fundraising and development, from who is our network of supporters, and how are we currently doing that? What are the events, campaigns, approaches that we use to raise that money? In this articulation of current reality, I would also look at who is the team, what are the resources that we have to build relationships and to create connections. What are our existing relationships and contacts in our communities? Who are the network of people we know, whether they're giving to us or not? What are the relationships that exist we might be able to build on? What is the need? What are some of the things that we're looking for support for? What are some of the things that we can connect people to, that we can create meaning around? And what are some of the opportunities around which we can build support? What are some of the places in which we see the interests of communities and funders aligning with our interests? How can we take advantage of those opportunities? So the first thing we're going to do with our team when we sit down to do this development planning cycle is to really go through our current reality and articulate that with each other. The second thing in a planning cycle is to really look at where we're trying to go. What are we trying to achieve here, and setting some goals. And what I found a lot in fundraising and development is that we set very nebulous goals about we're going to increase support. We're going to get more donors. The problem with that is without being more specific in some way, it doesn't really push us to make something happen, and B, it doesn't really allow us to celebrate success because we're not really able to say, wow, we really did what we set out to do if it's not a sort of clear set of goals and intentions. And so, I encourage people to think about how you want to characterize and quantify the achievements or targets that you want to set for fundraising. You can set this by dollar value. We want to increase our fundraising support this year by $10,000. It might be by number of gifts. We want to build our network of support. We're not focusing on the money, but we'd like to bring in a dozen new donors to our organization this year. Or it could be a percentage growth. We'd like to overall grow our contributed revenue support this year by 5%. But really setting some goals for yourself and addressing like what we would like to do. I think it's also often helpful to divide your goals a little bit by different aspects of fundraising. So, we'd like to increase our grant support by X amount, or bring in one new institutional grant donor. We'd like to, focus on bringing in 3 new major donors in our individual category that give $250 or more. Those kinds of goals can really help you to sort of focus on how the big goal breaks down, so that if the big goal is daunting to folks, if it's like bringing in $10,000 and people can't get their heads around that, maybe we can break that down into a format where people really can sort of see and figure out how they're going to make that happen. And then remember that the goals that you're setting are going to be the way that you assess your success at the end of the cycle or year of activity that you're undertaking. So then the next thing we need to do is move into this sort of relationship building cycle of activity. And building relationships is something that we do naturally all the time in different aspects of our lives, but we don't necessarily sort of do that with a mindful lens. And so trying to break this relationship building down into a sort of series of steps or aspects of relationships that I think are important and useful for you to know. So the first thing that we need to do, if we're really talking about building new relationships, or if we're thinking about developing existing relationships, is to identify prospective supporters. Think about who do we need to be focusing on in terms of these relationships? Who are the people for whom this work could be meaningful or is meaningful? And so how do we do that? Well, first of all, looking at who already donates to you. Who are those supporters that are already in our network? What's the state of our relationship with them? Are they prospective supporters that we can continue to grow and develop? Second is looking at the people who have signaled interest in your organization by attending your programming, getting on your mailing list, etc. Looking at your database and saying who's in here that we might want to nurture and build support with. Looking at and mapping your networks, thinking about, okay, can we sit down with our board and map out who they know in the community, who they're connected with, who might find this meaningful and engaging. Let's start to look at what are the connections we have within the organization, with our artists, with our staff. Who are the networks we engage with? Who are the other nonprofits we work with? What are the connections we have or the relationships that we have that we can build on and deepen and connect? And so this sort of activity in terms of identifying prospective supporters is about looking at what relationships we have. How can we start to leverage those relationships to connect with new folks? How can we identify potential relationships that we could deepen or develop based on their interest to date? It is critically important in this idea of identifying prospective supporters that we have some way to track our relationships, to keep a record of the folks that we interact with in whatever aspect of our work, and to really understand how our relationship with them develops over time. And so for most organizations, this means some kind of a database, whether you're doing it on an Excel spreadsheet or whether you have a fancy software package. It's about how do you ensure that you've got data and that you can search the data and use the data to continue to build those relationships. In terms of capturing data, which is often a challenge for nonprofit arts groups who don't necessarily have a lot of control of, how do we get new names and new people into our database? There are a couple of tips from folks who've been successful in sort of building their network of names. First, really looking at how do you make it fun and easy for people to sign up, to become part of your mailing list, your database, etc. Can you offer an incentive? Is there a draw for folks putting their names in, etc. But making it more than just an activity, but something that has some fun or potential impact for them. Second is the more personal, the better. If somebody they know can ask them if they'd like to be on the mailing list, if they would be willing to kind of sign up using a social media campaign, if they would connect with your Facebook page, etc. Someone they know and trust, asking them to make that connection has greater impact. And so really thinking about how do we use our networks to connect those folks into our network. Being really clear about your policies, about not selling or trading their names, which legally you cannot do, but people are fearful about the loss of control of data. So being really upfront about how you respect their data and their information and see them as people you're in a relationship with, as opposed to as simply a list of names. And finally, really spend your time and energy on the people who want to be part of that network. If somebody is reticent to give you their data, they're probably not looking to be in a relationship with you. And so I think that's when it's time to move on and think about who else might be in your network. And so you're going to go through this process as you're planning, as you're thinking about your strategy for the year, of identifying who are some of the supporters who are already in our network that we want to deepen relationships with, and who are some of the folks who currently aren't supporting us, but who we think might find what we do meaningful, and how can we kind of get their data and information so that we can start to build a relationship with them. Which leads to the sort of second part of this relationship building cycle, which is the critical piece of relationship building, which is what I call cultivation here. it's this sort of idea of, this is not the ask for money. This is not the like, will you give us support? This is the getting to know you, building a relationship, deepening connection. This is understanding them and what their interests are, and them understanding you and what your vision, value, and work is. And so cultivation is a process. It's an important, sort of component of this development plan that we create. And it really involves two basic pieces of work. One is connection. How do we create opportunities for connection? How do we create events where people can meet other people in the organization and get interested? Or, how can we create opportunities for folks to meet the artists and learn more about the artist life and interests? How do we make those sort of connection opportunities happen? That's a big part of cultivating relationships. It's being with the people, it's connecting with the people, it's learning about and from the people. The second big part of cultivation is communication. And communication is, how do we bring people into our process? How do we tell them about what we do? How do we engage them? How do we give them a sense of ownership or connection to what's happening with us? And that might be things like newsletters and emails. It might be, that our board members are updating their network of supporters through their social media or other activities. But getting the word out, sharing with people insights into the process and the work, really critical, pieces to this sort of relationship building. And so I think, having a cultivation plan for the year where you identify different events and opportunities to create connection, where you identify different tools and ways in which you will communicate and build and deepen relationships with insights and engagement, are sort of critical throughout the year, throughout the process, to continue to build relationships and deepen those relationships with folks that you're trying to engage. And some opportunities might be better for deepening relationships with folks who are already connected to you. Some relationships may be better for creating new relationships, sort of introductory opportunities, as it were, to introduce folks to who you are and what you do, whether that's a cocktail party that someone hosts, that allows folks to come together in a social environment and learn a little about your organization, or whether that's a town hall or showcase that you do to show off and tell a little bit about your organization, thinking about those entry level events as well. And so together with your team, you can kind of create a framework of an annual cycle of cultivation tools and events and activities to really build and nurture those relationships. One of the things that I always suggest to nonprofit arts groups is really focus on what you're already doing. You probably have a bunch of things that people would be very interested in, whether that's the sort of process that goes into creating your work and how can you open that up or communicate about that effectively, to the events that you're already putting on for mission delivery, and how do you make those opportunities to bring people together, to connect with each other and to connect with the work. So it doesn't require you to create all new infrastructure here. It's also about looking at what have we got and how do we use that to deepen and create connections with people. Then we get to the part that everybody is reticent to jump into, which is making the ask. And I do want to point out that in this fundraising and development plan, make the ask is the fifth thing on my list. It's not like making the ask is 90% of the work that happens. And in fact, it's probably only 10% of the work that happens in fundraising. But make the ask is here after cultivation, because that is when we want to make the ask. After people already know us, already are connected to us, already find meaning in what we do. It's the cold call, it's the ask out of nowhere that is difficult and awkward for folks. If we really do our work in cultivating relationships, then making the ask is really a matter of connecting what they care about and what they are trying to achieve with what we care about and what we're trying to achieve. And so really sort of looking at this opportunity, how are we going to make the ask? Is it, is it a campaign letter? Is it a personal appeal that somebody who's who's connected with the organization is going to make for a particular project or program. What are we going to ask for in terms of amount of money? What are we going to ask for in terms of the kind of project or program or general operating support? So really thinking through who's going to make the asks, how are the asks going to be made? In some cases, we don't have a lot of control. For example, with a government funder, making the ask is putting in your grant application and they prescribe that process. But with individuals, you have more leeway to think about what is the best way for us to make an ask of this person, and really thinking about what's appropriate for the person and the relationship that you, the organization and the individuals within it have with that person. I have done a bit of asking for support myself, and I know that it gets easier as you do more of it, and you know, practice is good. It's great to buddy people up. I know that sometimes board members are uncertain about how to approach it. If they can be buddied up with another board member who maybe has more experience and make some asks together, that often helps them to feel more comfort with it. My tips for making the ask: be genuine, go in with a true belief in your organization, in what you're asking them about. That shines through. People see that you care about it and you're connected to it. And that makes a difference in how they approach it. Be gracious. Clearly, you know, they may give, they may not. Thank them for their time. Tell them how much you hope they will continue to sort of be involved in whatever ways they are. Be direct. Don't beat around the bush with an ask. It gets more awkward the longer you let it linger. I think it's often helpful to get the ask out of the way early in your conversation to open the door for a discussion, as opposed to having a lot of small talk and finally getting to it in the last 5 minutes of your time with someone. Be quiet. Listen as much as you talk when you're making an ask. We often overtalk the response to an ask. We often keep talking when folks are ready to tell us what they think. And so make an ask and then sit back and listen for what people have to say or reflect or discuss. Be open to different possibilities. Sometimes what you ask for is not what they can give, but they will sometimes suggest what they can give. And so be ready for things to go in a different direction. And finally, be confident. You are there asking for support for a valuable organization and mission. Feel confident in the importance of that work and that organization. The confidence that you come in with often puts others at ease as well and makes the ask go more smoothly. And the final thing to say about make the ask is this is the one step of fundraising that often gets left out. People get into the idea of, okay, we've set goals, we've identified prospects, we cultivate and cultivate and cultivate, and then they never get a direct ask in. If you don't ask people for money, they often don't know you need it or want it. We think people understand that about our organizations, but they often don't. They often don't know that that's needed or desired. And so we do need to ask people, and we need to make sure that in our plan, there's a specific strategy for making the ask. After we make the ask, no matter what happens with the ask, we need to, because it's a relationship, we need to follow up and track what happened in that moment, in that interaction. It's really important that we don't, after we make an ask, sort of drop people and you know, stop the relationship sort of cold there. If they have given support, obviously there are some obvious next steps like tax receipts, acknowledgement letters, etc., thank yous from the organization. If they've not given, it's often really helpful to have an immediate follow-up to say, you know, we're really glad to have you as part of our community. Here are some of the events coming up that we hope you'll participate in, so that they understand that even if they don't give, we still value them and want them in our community. And so keeping that going, and again, with our database, making sure that we're tracking what was our interaction, what was the result, so that we know that as we continue to deepen and develop this relationship, we know where we are with each of our supporters and potential supporters. And then finally, we come back to our overall plan and our goals at the end of our year of fundraising. And we take time to assess our results. We look at what were our goals and what were our results. How did we do? What can we celebrate? Let's bring our team together and celebrate our successes. And let's adapt our strategies. Well, if this particular thing did not work for us, if it did not deepen our relationships and achieve our fundraising goals, let's come up with a different approach and start to adapt our strategies to reflect what we're learning in the process. And so together, these 2 cycles and these 7 activities, if you really think through these and create a plan around these, it gives you a framework of fundraising that's built on this idea of creating and deepening relationships around meaning, around purpose, around values. And that, for many organizations and almost all of the nonprofits that I work with, is what really results in a greater success than sort of one-off efforts that often get sort of foisted on us. So that's my quick rundown of the world of relational fundraising and development. I want to open it up for any questions, comments, things that I missed, or things that you're finding in your work that you want to sort of reflect on. And of course, as always, we will send this out to you so that you can review anything. We will send out the slides that I shared and the handout so that you can share those with your colleagues as well. And as you all know, I'm around if you have questions after the fact here. If you're looking at materials and you want to follow up with me, I certainly am always happy to speak with you and to share any ideas or thoughts on how this relates particularly to you and your organizations. All right, Alex, I'm going to throw it back to you to wrap up, and we'll finish for the day.
Thanks, Anne. It's yeah, I think it's a lot in there that people are familiar with. It's just nice when you frame it and articulate it. That's an easy way to share. So I encourage those here to share it with your boards. It's a way to sort of make it understandable what the work is and what needs doing to activate those resources that haven't been fully utilized yet. But yeah, we're nearing 3 o'clock, and I know it's a busy afternoon for people. So thank you everyone again. And Carmel will make this video available for everyone.
Oh, yes. Yeah.